There we go.
Why is this one of the most important pieces of
I think the reason why it's so staggering is because it paints so much emotion. Like there's no emotion on the jailer's face. There's absolute emotion on this old woman. The prisoners are clearly like, what the heck? The size of the piece, it's like super arresting. I've never seen it in person. I'd love to, but all of those kind of are contributing factors to like it being just a very staggering piece of work.
Interesting how young he is too.
Yeah,
And how old he should be.
right. That is correct. Uh, yeah. The crazy part is, so he based this off of a prison in Malta, which is where he would be jailed, Caravaggio, for essentially being a psychopath, which we'll get to in future weeks. So, yeah, no, it's John the Baptist.
What's going on with everyone's vision line is funky.
Everyone's vision line is funky. Yeah, they're all staring at different stuff for sure. But it actually makes you intrigued at like what they're actually looking at. So it's a good. We'll get to this a lot in the next 5 weeks, but there's a lot of stuff you can do by misdirecting people or leaving stuff ambiguous, but for the purpose of serving interest in order that they might pay more attention. We'll just let that hang for a minute, but especially as we get into narrative, you can tie the bow too tightly and make stories boring, which is maybe the closest thing to a sin in preaching as I can think of. Let me get a Bible. That's probably important. I hear. All right. So, this is an exciting day. This is one of my favorite days, instruction-wise. These two instructions paired back to back. We're continuing our stuff on argument by talking about two particular aspects of argument. Now, on the basis of the first hour on argument, what's something that you've learned about argument? Just in general. It doesn't need to be something technical or specific, but just something that stood out to you about argument. Short and sweet. What else?
It's gotta be singular.
It's got to be singular. No ands. Argue one thing. This isn't some weird CCP thing or some slavish devotion to Aristotle. This is how public speech works. Argue one thing. Help your listener. Anything else? Yeah, it should be sharp. So while it needs to be short and sweet, it could be too short, which then loses some of its sharpness. So finding that ideal middle ground is incredibly challenging. But hopefully you've even come to see as you've preached a few times or are preparing to preach for your first time today, that it's like, oh, this can actually be really helpful, primarily in helping us see the relationship between all this stuff in the text, right? What do I keep in? What do I keep out? If I am keeping it in, what kind of role is it playing? Argument really helps you. I was just listening to a guy named Matthew. I think his first name is Matthew. But his last name is Dix, and he writes books on how to help people tell stories. We're going to use some of his work in the coming weeks. But one of the things that he's so insistent on is it's actually the end of the story that matters the most, which is similar to our sermons. It's actually where the sermon's going to land that matters the most. Everything else is in service to that end. So as I've said, it doesn't have to be this way in your preaching, and it's super boring if it's always this way in your preaching. But your main point should be able to function like the last sentence in your sermon that absolutely brings resolution. Therefore, sentence, and everybody goes, oh, of course, instead of what the heck is going on. The trouble is, we've got to kind of figure out how to get to where we're going. So if that's kind of the main point, and we know that roughly everything serves that main point, then the question is how are we going to get there? And so what we're going to talk about in this hour is something called confirmation. Well, let me make that bigger. Let's talk about the idea of confirmation and proofs. talk about confirmation first and then proofs. Proofs are actually how we do the act of confirmation. So imagine a river, okay? This is a river. I was just in Texas. In Texas, they've got this thing they're very proud of called the Brazos River, which runs all the way through Texas, right? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Wow.
It's one of those things that you're just like, oh, ooh.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Alamo, like, wow, building.
That's right. Yeah. But it is water, and Texas is terrible. So, you need something. So if you imagine this river being like your sermon, you all start on one side of the river, and you're, by the way, the river guide. You are guiding a group of people across this river. So if you conceptualize the entirety of the sermon, like the intro is where you start and the conclusion is where you end, which I know is profound, then you're trying to get people from one side of the river to the other side of the river. Now, nobody's going to get with you and want to cross the river unless you give them some kind of idea of where you're going. Sometimes, as we've talked about, as we'll continue to talk about, it's very explicit. You're going to say, hey, we are going to cross this river and we are going to land on X right here. This is exactly where we're going to go. That's like giving away your main point from the beginning. It's a good practice to get into. It doesn't have to happen this way. Or it can be even kind of like more general. It's like we're going to be in this general area across the river. That's a little more obscure. Or even like, hey, it's on that side. It's over there somewhere. Don't you want to go? But in order for us to want to follow you, then two things need to happen in order to kind of get people to want to go with you. They don't want to go with you just because you're standing behind the pulpit. Two things. Number one, these are just very broad. One, you have to make the end desirable. So think about like a sermon that's a question and an answer. It has to be a question that I would like an answer to. Or if it's a problem-solution kind of sermon, it's a problem that I've got to feel. It's like, do you have any solution to that? So the end, that solution needs to be desirable. The answer needs to be desirable. But I have to desire the thing. And number two, I have to have the means to achieve the end. I got to know that like we can actually get there. Now imagine that in this river, what you've got in the river in order to help you get across are rocks. Let's imagine that there's 3 rocks in the river because a bunch of you are Baptists, so every sermon's got to have 3 points. Amen. That's right. Let's imagine for the sake that this is it. Point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, and maybe you're going to give them away. Maybe you're going to be obscure about them. We're going to see 3 arenas in which this thing takes place, whatever the thing is that you're kind of arguing. We're going to see 3, 3 ways we can go about being sure of whatever this thing is. But now I have the means of achieving that. Or you could be like point 1, point 2, point 3. It can be explicit, can be implicit. But you've got to help us achieve the desired end. I need to sow the desire in you first. Second, you're going to help me out in figuring out how to get there. So the act of confirmation is simply this. The act of confirmation is moving across the river. That's what we're doing. Trying to move people across the river. Guide them across the river. Now our homiletical points, as we've talked about before, are not necessarily an exact copy of the text structure, but they are a reflection of it. There's some kind of correspondence between what the author is doing and what you're doing. And as we talk about in future weeks, it's really an art to figure out how to move these people across this river. Hopefully it makes the text make even more sense than when they read it originally. Your task is to bring clarity. And so the act of confirmation is moving them across the river from stone to stone because nobody likes to get wet in the river. We're trying to get them across to dry land. The end is desirable, and I have the means of achieving that end. So the question is, how do we get them across the river? A few very brief points about homiletical points in general that will help you out. We'll talk more about this in the future, but just a few things. First, the order of your homiletical points should be logical. Makes sense. You get to the first rock and you're like, is everybody on the first rock? Check this rock out. This rock's pretty dope. All right, now everybody, let's go to the second rock. And people shouldn't be like, seriously? What are you talking about? Why would we go to that rock? You should be like, okay, I see that rock. I want to go from this rock to that rock. It's a logical progression. But another one that goes along with logical is that the order of our homiletical points should show movement. So as, I don't remember if it's Broadus or Dabney says it, like you should not have division without distinction. So it's a logical move, but it's also like, oh yeah, that's something else that is carrying us forward. That's not saying the same thing, but just using a different word. This is something else. We're going somewhere. We're not just kind of hopping from rock to rock without any forward movement. That doesn't seem to be helpful. So we're actually moving across the river. Now the main way that this happens is to kind of be logical and show movement, especially the movement side, is to avoid at all costs this kind of speech. Ready? Here's how bad speeches work. They move from point to point by using this language. And then. This is the way like 3-year-olds tell stories. Or just friends of yours that are really boring. I went to the store, and then I bought some ice cream, and then I came home, and then I ate the ice cream. You're like, oof, wow, great story. That's not actually a story. Nothing was learned. You didn't actually, all you did was get some ice cream and come home. Like, congratulations. Thank you for telling me about your day. It's maybe a recounting of something, but it's not actually a story. And in a sermon, it's just not like there's point 1, and there's point 2, and there's point 3. The easiest way to show movement is to simply switch the way you're talking about things. Let me tell you the way stories move. They only move in one of 2 ways. It all boils down to this. And then is anathema. What is helpful are 2 very simple ways, and we're going to put these things into practice in a couple weeks. You either conceptualize the moves as therefore or but. Okay? I went, I realized I didn't have any ice cream. Therefore, I went to the store because the store has the ice cream that I wanted. But when I was at the store, while I wanted mint chip, they didn't have any. Therefore, I had to make a different kind of decision. But I realized as I was standing there that ice cream is only for pagans. Therefore, I decided to get some blue cheese and salami instead, because that's glorious. Because I had all the requisite materials to have a delicious dessert, I therefore traveled to my house. But when I got there, I didn't have plates. Nice thing is, you don't need plates to have a delicious dessert. Therefore, I simply slammed that stuff in my gullet. And what I learned was blue cheese and salami is far better than any ice cream. The thing I wanted is not the thing I got, but the thing I got was far better than the thing I wanted. Well, now we've got a story. I learned a life lesson, all kinds of. But notice, it's almost the same way of telling the story, but it just moves. It doesn't always have to be therefore, but, therefore, but. It can be either of those things. Therefore, 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 but. The buts are always the most interesting thing to me. And I think to most of us when we think about stories, because the world doesn't turn out the way we thought it would. Something makes it so that we thought we were going down one path, but we have to change. always be looking for this stuff. I'm just setting you up for the next 5 weeks of our lives. Always be looking for the things you're not expecting in the story. And lean into those things because those are always the most important things. This will help show movement. It's either causal, therefore the next thing is a causal relationship, or there's an interruption. Hey, we're going here. Hey, but you carry on that way. Easiest way to show movement instead of just and then, and then, and then. So the question is, how do we do this? And what I'm about to show you is going to sound blatantly obvious. Because almost all the stuff we do in this rhetoric stuff is blatantly obvious. It's not a matter of getting something new. It's a matter of becoming aware of what we already find immensely pleasing. Not simply to scratch itching ears, but to help people listen to the message from God for us. Because unfortunately, a lot of our preaching robs the Bible from people. We're trying to help people pay attention to what God's Word actually says. And we do that by using proofs. That's what we're going to talk about, proofs. Proofs are the means by which we do this stuff on confirmation. Now, the nice thing is there's only two kinds of proofs in the world, in any kind of speech. Only two. It comes down to this. Inartistic. That's the first one. Anybody have a guess on what the second one is? Nailed it. Artistic. That was pretty artistic of you. That's right. Inartistic proofs are simply this. It's the material you don't invent. It's just there for the taking. Inartistic stuff has nothing to say about the content of the material itself, but everything to say with it, like you're not coming up with it. It's just there. Now, in the case of the preacher, what is the inartistic proof at our disposal? The text. Nailed it. Now again, I'm not saying the Bible isn't artistic. In fact, one of the reasons why our preaching is so terrible is because we go about preaching the Bible like it's not very artistic, and we turn something that is artistic into something inartistic. That's the problem. All I mean by inartistic in this sense is verse 6 says, I mean, isn't that what you find in verse 7? Well, why would I believe something like that? I mean, verse 8, you're just picking up what's in the text. Think about a lawyer. What would be the kind of inartistic proof for a lawyer? The law. That's right, so you have case law. What else? Evidence. Nailed it. As you can see right here, right? This shoe is very clearly size 15, and PK's feet are not. PK can put both of his feet in a size 15 shoe, right? But the shoe itself is the inartistic proof, which is something I'm putting my finger on some case law in 1963, right? In Brown versus Ferguson or whatever, this thing happened, and you just kind of point to a case law. Now, is that stuff necessary in the court of law? In artistic proof? Absolutely. Is it necessary for the preacher? I hope you're persuaded that the Bible is important in preaching. I will say you need to prove that to me, not only what you say, but in your preaching. But it is very much important. Why is it not sufficient? Let's ask this. Because again, is the Bible not sufficient? We're not talking about the sufficiency of Scripture. But what demonstrates that the inartistic proof of the Bible is, we all believe, that it's not sufficient for the act of preaching. Not in and of itself, but just like the inartistic proof is not sufficient. What proves that it's not enough all by itself?
There wouldn't be a need for preachers.
Nailed it. What would there be a need for?
Just Bibles.
Learning Greek and Hebrew, maybe, right? Bibles, and the ability to read. Because there's a real question. There's a real question that you need to be consciously aware of all the time. Why would you deign to stand in a pulpit and do anything else than read the Bible? This is especially true, by the way. I'm going to hit you with this a few times, but you should be ashamed that Roman Catholics hear far more of the Bible in one Sunday than they are likely to hear in your church in a month or maybe two. You people believe that the Bible is powerful. You people believe that Paul tells Timothy to dedicate himself to the Bible, not only the preaching of it, but even just the reading of it out loud in public. So let me just say that you should be ashamed of how little Bible is probably read in your church on Sunday. That point was for free. That's not even what we're talking about today. But it is weird that you would say, hey, I'm going to read these 3 verses, which takes me roughly 15 seconds, and then I'm going to talk to you about these 3 verses, hopefully, for the next 40 minutes. We all implicitly know that it's not enough in the act of confirmation to simply read it and go, so there you go, let's pray and you can go on your merry way. Whatever else you're saying, anything else that comes out of your mouth falls in the category of not inartistic proofs, but artistic proofs. And all the public speech is the interplay between the inartistic proofs and the artistic proofs. Now, if the inartistic is the material we don't come up with, again, I'm starting easy on the logic thing because I know we haven't had a lot of coffee. What would the artistic proof be? The material we do come up with. The material we do invent. And when I mean invent, all I'm saying is you're coming up with it for yourself. Now again, if a lawyer just starts to get up there and say a bunch of things and never refers to case law or evidence, does that lawyer have a chance of winning? No, of course not. In fact, that lawyer is probably going to be laughed out of court. The inartistic proof is vital. The artistic proof is simply there to help you understand the inartistic proof. That's what we're doing. We're not putting on a show. We're not trying to just be impressive. We're trying to make the inartistic proof make sense, to carry us across the river. Now, in this artistic world, which is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, there's 3 kinds of artistic proofs that we can use. There's 3 kind of broad realms of artistic proof. And again, this is going to absolutely be like no dust stuff, but we're trying to become consciously competent of these things in order that we might use them better. So, some of this is going to be in reference to the handout in front of you. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's think about the first area. What's the first area? On your sheet. Logic. That's right. These are appeals to logic. That's the first kind of artistic proof that we've got. We're trying to help people understand why what the inartistic proof is makes sense. This is the appeal to logic. You might say it's the appeal to the head. Your goal is to make what you are saying reasonable, and what the text is saying reasonable. Because if it doesn't make sense, then nothing else really matters. Now this is huge, because if you're not going about the work of making the text make sense, what could you leave people with the impression of? It would be a real bad thing. The Bible is complex. Yeah, not even pastors can understand it. You're making God seem unreasonable. I mean, think about it. If you've had any pastoral counseling experience, isn't this a thing that, I'm not even talking like unbelievers, worldly people, pagans or whatever. I'm talking about church people. Don't they often wrestle with the reasonableness of God? Give me an example. Why would God allow bad things to happen to good people? Good. Something else? Great. Yeah, I've gone through a lot of suffering, so why is he allowing me to suffer even more in this moment? These are real things that people wrestle with. Many preachers fail at presenting reasonable sermons. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree with you. But are you giving something to people that they could even disagree with? Or is it so convoluted that they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about? It's not easy to do because each part of the sermon must be reasonable. The travel across the river has got to be reasonable. The reason why you're moving to a second point needs to be reasonable. That's what we're aiming at, though, not some kind of logic puzzle. This isn't like some kind of philosophical inquiry, but what we're trying to achieve is reasonableness. So that believer, unbeliever alike, however much they agree or disagree with what you're saying, goes, all right, well, you got a point there. That makes sense. It's reasonable. Now, yes?
Should a preacher ever use fallacy to make their argument?
A fallacy to make their argument. If the New Testament is any indication, then the answer to that is yes. And we'll talk about that in the next hour. But yes, should they? Now, they shouldn't just use a fallacy to show that they're smart. And if you're like, I don't even know what a fallacy is, we will briefly touch on it in the next hour. Because, again, this is not some kind of logic class or whatever. But there are intriguing ways to get people to understand the reasonableness of things. Now, there's three kinds of mental activity that we can engage in when we're in communication, including preaching. And these all fit under the appeals to logic. But here they are. They're understanding, judging, and reasoning. These are the three kinds of mental activity. So understanding is know, don't know. You say something, you're making sense of that thing, and you can say, oh, now I know about that thing, or I don't know what you're talking about. When it comes to judging, we're talking true, false. Oh, what you're saying is true, or what you are saying is false. It's that simple. Or reasoning, that's valid or invalid. And so you're appealing to logic to help people understand. I now know what you're talking about. I understand. I believe that that thing is true. And that your point, however much I appreciate or don't, whatever you're talking about, all right, that's valid. That's what we're trying to achieve. So there's questions you should be asking yourself all the time. I hope these questions haunt your imagination for the rest of all time. Questions like this. Am I anticipating counter-arguments to my position? Am I presenting relevant counter-arguments in a way that is clear and fair? I'm not straw-manning people. These are real objections and counter-arguments to whatever the text is saying, whatever I'm saying. Am I qualifying my claims? Or am I just winging things out of the universe? Usually our statements about Jesus are these like completely unqualified claims. He's the king of the universe. He's in control of all of our lives. And you just like wing it out there. You're like, wait, are you going to qualify that at all? Or are you just going to say that like we all believe that? Are my qualifications robust, legitimate, honest, believable, etc.? Am I effectively conceding all that I can and must, which we're going to talk about in the next hour? Am I refuting patiently all I can and must? Am I using evidence for my major claims? There's one reason why we force you to put a text down in your gospel connection instead of just saying things. It's like, oh yeah, where's that in the Bible? Is Scripture my primary evidence? Now, it's not the only evidence that you can wield in a sermon. Give me another kind of perfectly valid and legitimate form of inartistic proof that you can and probably should wield in a sermon. Testimony. Good. What else? Data. Yeah, about the world. Great. Some kind of study out there or something. Just demonstrate that, like, this isn't just your opinion. It seems to be the way the world works. Great. Am I grounding my evidence in texts or just general theological truths? What assumptions am I making, explicitly or implicitly? Are they warranted? Why? This is one reason why I highly encourage, and depending on who you are, force you to ask questions instead of just make statements. We all struggle with depression. That's probably true to some degree. But that is an assumption. Why don't you just turn it into a question? You ever struggle with depression? I'm accomplishing the same end. I think there's probably some validity to this. But I'll just put it in the form of a question. It comes off a lot softer. It's a lot easier to receive, and you engage me in thought. Well, I guess I do. Maybe not as much as that guy, but I do. You should be reasonable. The atheist that walks out of your sermon should think, I don't believe in that God. But dang it, if what you're saying does make sense, and that's bothersome. But logic is not enough. Logic is helpful. Logic is good. Logic is necessary. But logic is not enough. Why is logic not enough?
We're not computers.
Because we're not computers. We're not brains on sticks. Which is why, in addition to appealing to logic, we also have to appeal to what? That's right. Appeal to emotion. This is something many young men are terrible at. As one writer on persuasion says, very helpful, to convince your listener of what you think, you must first feel what you say. You ever sit there in those sermons? They're like, this all makes sense. I get what you're saying, but you sure don't seem to feel anything. You're like a robot. And you're talking to me like I'm a robot. That if you just figure out the logic puzzle right, that I'll just believe. You have to engage in people's emotions, speaking directly to people's hearts, not just their heads. Now, what's interesting is how normal this is in regular speech. Even pastors are pretty good at this. Like, what's something, I want to hear from two of you, and you can't copy the other person. What's something that, while overused and can go weird, what's something you're passionate about? This can't have anything to do with Christianity or the Bible.
Can get weird.
No, you're just passionate about it.
Not asking about your fetish.
Yeah. That's for the next hour.
Shoes.
Something, huh?
Shoes.
Shoes. There we go. Shoes. I do not understand that at all, but that's very, very true. If you ever talk to PK, you're like, oh, dude, okay, chill out. Good. Somebody else. What? Soccer. Okay. What did you say? Food. Okay. Soccer, food, shoes. You guys all have like this small bubble. Some of your bubbles are bigger. Of like things that when I get engaged in this thing, I'm just in. This is true for everybody. And the weirdest thing when it comes to a pastor is that you can be talking to PK, just to pick on him, about like shoes, and then PK like Sunday morning, right? And PK's like, check out these dope kicks. Like, just got these things. I waited all night, bro, and like almost didn't get it. But then like amazingly, I got in and I won the lottery or whatever the heck he does. And he's like, so I got these things. You're like, okay, cool. And then that same pastor will often walk up and go, beloved, please open the Bible. Today we are going to be... And you're like, what? What happened to you? And maybe, like, the whole sermon goes that way, and you're just like, why is it that you can't be excited about this? We know that we can get excited about some things, that we can speak with emotion, appealing to other people's emotions on this stuff, and yet we avoid it in the pulpit. Now, for some of us, there's a certain hesitancy to engage on the level of emotions in the pulpit, right? And there's some good reason for this, maybe. Swagger. What do you mean by that?
He became so emotional and so that he basically left the scripture behind. And it just became
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, swagger. So like he's
The one that went and left his wife too.
swaggart. Oh, swaggart. Okay. I think you just meant swagger, like a general, like, check this out. But it can be all about you, right? Like, watch me, like, get emotional up here. And you're like, okay. But you have people who just, like, leave the Bible behind but can cry and all that kind of stuff and get you very moved. Yeah, he's not here. Hi, Brett. So what else? Why might we avoid the kind of engaging people on level of emotions?
We can be too hesitant to manipulate. Like we don't want to.
That's right. Should we want to manipulate people?
Yes. For their own good.
Yes, for their own good, but not just manipulate for manipulation's sake.
persuade, not manipulate.
Yeah. So there is because manipulate only has negative connotations. So we're not just like screwing around with people, and so we should be like, yeah, no, I don't want to just like mess with people. But it's like, okay, so while avoiding that, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Do you actually care? Do you want us to care? Why should I care? We engage on an emotional level about all kinds of things, stupid things like shoes. The key idea here when it comes to the appeal to emotion is this: proportionality. It's proportional. Your emotions must match the subject. Usually you guys struggle in here, and I'm just talking about y'all, where like you get as excited or into or emotional about verse 6 as you do the resurrection of Jesus. And it's like, these are different things. And so it feels off on just this intangible kind of level, because it's like, wait a second, like there's no emotion here from you towards us, things we should feel. Get people engaged.
Match the tone of the text.
Yeah, match the tone of the text. That's one way to help. You're getting to our questions. Not every sermon will have the same level of emotion, will it?
No.
Some are incredibly emotionally laden, and others aren't. And so again, the proportionality is not just like you to us or you to who you are naturally, but even in regard to the content before you. How do I decide how much to interact with people's emotions? That's the question. And the answer is be prudent. That's really what this is. It's an act of prudence. And by the way, you're not going to know till you screw up. So fail with great confidence. Right? Like, I don't think that most of you have a problem with going overboard on this. You don't even get close to the level. And one of the great parts about being here at the course is we'll tell you if you went overboard. But for most of you, not that guy, but for most of you, my encouragement is, while trying to be proportional, push your limits. And let us tell you, you should probably pull it back some. Now, what it looks like to engage people's emotions and to be emotionally engaged yourself is going to depend not only on the text, but also you, which is why it's proportional. It's like, oh, that matches who you are. When you talk about shoes when you're in the pulpit, most of you are not nearly as level of spaz as I am, right? Just like, okay, I'm very proudly mentally ill adjacent, right? It's fine. Like, so don't think, and this is what's a real temptation for young preachers, is like, oh, to engage on an emotional level is to preach like that guy. Well, not if you're not that guy, and you're not that guy. Therefore, it's who you are. It's who you are in the moment of like, I've prepared, I've come up here. If you preach long enough, you'll figure this out. Like, your emotions change even in the very preaching. And that's not only one direction. It's not just like you were happy, but now you're sad, although that could happen. It could be that like you don't even want to really preach this week. And you're just struggling, like, dear Lord, help me be emotionally engaged in this sermon. And then you just look out and you see that like this thing hit somebody with so much like hope that it'll completely change you, which is another reason to be off your notes and looking people in the face. Now, be warned, emotionalism is ruinous. And I mean ruinous. And so you might be thinking, I'd rather not do this. It sounds complicated, so I'll just avoid this. There's a couple problems with that. The first problem is, it's completely unnatural to avoid this. What's another problem?
Connecting to a person on that level.
Yeah.
Just completely void of any interpersonal thing like that.
Right. Your call is to engage with real human beings. So you're actually denying people's humanity when you don't engage them emotionally.
How is your audience supposed to know how to process their emotions?
Yeah. Yeah. This is, and we'll get to this later on, like preaching is an act of discipleship. You're training people how they ought to respond to things. And if you don't ever get there, then people are going to be like, I know all the right things. I know it's true and untrue, valid and invalid, but I don't know how to actually process the world that I live in. So you're actually robbing people from the benefit of growing in knowing how to respond emotionally to other people, to God, all this stuff. I mean, just look at these questions. These are the questions you need to be asking yourself. Am I using emotionally charged or quote-unquote loaded language well and sparingly? What emotional response am I seeking to achieve? And is this language appropriate to that end? Even like, not even like the language, but also the looks. Where like somebody's like got a smile on their face while they're talking about hell. You're like, this is not working. What are you doing? How could my language potentially move people in the wrong emotional direction? This is especially true when it's people that aren't like you. So always be thinking about the not yous in the room. Always be thinking, what's the worst way somebody could take this? Both on the logic level, but also on the emotional level. And especially if you're doing some crowd exegesis and you see somebody respond rather poorly to something, just think like, it's probably not them, it's probably me. That's not necessarily the case. It could be that they're just not paying attention or that they're just completely like, in defiance to what you're saying. That's possible. But you should always be most suspicious of yourself and not the hearer. Oof. And you see somebody's head fall. Just take a second. Now maybe that's hard to hear. You don't just stare that person down. Maybe that's incredibly challenging, and there's good reason to believe that. And then you're back to logic because you're trying to make sense of what's going on, but you're engaging them on all these things are combined. What emotions am I appealing to? Fear, pity, frustration, sadness, etc. Have I demonstrated the appropriate emotions toward believer and unbeliever alike? It's one of the reasons why next term you are only allowed to preach to unbelievers. Because I can't tell you the number of times that a preacher will get Christians all riled up about something that is, in its very essence, if true, incredibly challenging for unbelievers, and we're like, screw you people. Not explicitly, at least most of the time. If it's explicit, it's usually like, and the worldly people out there, it's like, there's no way in hell any of those people are in here. It's like, of course not. But you speak in such a way that it's like, wait, but if that's true for Christians, which is an incredibly hopeful thing, then that's not going to be easy to hear for non-Christians. Am I admitting that? Or conversely, something that's very hopeful for non-Christians is usually going to be a stick in the side of a Christian. I'll give you one example. If you're not a Christian here, and you're kind of wondering, like, is this stuff even true? Then you ought to hang out here. I dare you to hang out here and watch and see if it's actually true. Now, of course, you Christians in the room, what that means for you people is that you better be on your game. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's like, oh, no, right? So something that's a potential comfort to non-Christians, there's actually reason to believe this on the basis of our lives lived, becomes a provocative thing for the Christians in the room. So again, if I'm looking one direction, who's listening to this and responding in a way that's completely understandable, logical, and yet they have to understand that they're also in the game. I'm appealing to people's emotion. How am I demonstrating that I have a personal stake at issue? This issue that I'm preaching about. So often it's just like you. It can come across in our language, but even if it's not in our language, even if it's a we thing, I can't tell you the number of times I'm like, do you actually believe that about yourself? Not just logically, but like it seems like in this moment you're saying we, but it's very much like we. I have nothing at stake here. And sometimes it can be this kind of false piety. You know, I'm just a servant. I'm just trying to hide behind the cross, so I'm not going to get engaged in this. Man, how dare you? Just don't ever get in a pulpit again for the sake of all of us. Do you really think people are going to hell? Do you really think heaven is real? Freaking preach like it. Appeal to people's emotions. Lastly, it's a different kind of appeal. What's this appeal to? Appeal to character. Appeal to character. This is all about credibility. That's the word here. Credibility. So we've got reasonableness, we've got proportionality, and we've got credibility. Like, why should anybody listen to you? Let me give you one reason they shouldn't listen to you. It's because you're standing behind the pulpit. Who cares? You're a duly elected officer of the church. So what? Are you a credible speaker? Are the people you're speaking about credible? Are you making Jesus credible to people, or are you just telling people that he's credible? Prove it. In preaching the Bible, we're interestingly enough dealing with you, the preacher, the author, human and divine, and characters in the text. Our job is to make all of those characters credible, or demonstrate how they are credible. You don't have to make Jesus credible. He is credible, but prove it. I mean, Quintilian defines an order, you've heard this before, but I'll say it again, as a good man, expert in speech, and that order matters. You're a good person, expert in speech. If you expect much from your listeners, and you should, and you must, you're expecting them to change the entirety of their lives on the basis of this sermon. Every sermon you preach, you're trying to completely change their lives every single time. At least you should be. And most sermons fail because you're not doing that. But if you really expect everybody to change their lives on the basis of what you say from the Bible, then they have every right to expect that you're a changed person, that you're the kind of person that you're talking about. If you tell people to do something crazy like give up everything and follow Jesus, then they have the right to shout back at you. You freaking go first. You need to read your Bible. It's like, bro, you couldn't even do the scripture reading. And you supposedly studied this text all week. That's a major deal. If you screw up reading, you're like, well, there's just so many names. It's your frickin' job. Read the Bible. I can't tell you the number of times where I'm like, I'm unwilling to listen to you because you couldn't even read the text. So I'm supposed to believe you studied this thing when you can't even read it? It's down to the littlest things. The best teachers are admirable humans. Right? We're just like, I don't even know what it is. It's this intangible thing. It's like, I want to be like that guy. I can't even tell you why. I don't want to be that guy because I'm not that guy, but I want to be like that guy or like that woman. It's just a compelling speaker, not even what they're saying and the logic they're making or the appeal to the emotions, but like, this person's got my well-being in mind. The crazy thing is that who you are must be on display when you preach. It can't just be an internal conviction. The preacher gets up and goes, I love you! And you're like, why don't you put it on your face? Something I got to tell like young married guys all the time. It's like, yeah, we're just having a real hard time. Because like my wife doesn't think that I love her. And it's like, yeah, it's because you're an idiot. And you don't show it like in your actions or on your face or anything. Your words don't mean anything. You wake up every morning, punch your wife in the face and be like, love you. She'd be like, don't think so. Put it on your face, not just in your heart of hearts, wherever the heck that is. I mean, it's on display in what you say. So work hard at speaking well. It's on display in even how you move. Like your very posture and presence in the pulpit has a lot to do with you being a credible speaker. Which is one reason why you shouldn't just do this the whole time and be like, I really care about you. Because the thing is, I really love all of you from the profundity of my heart, and I've worked really hard to... Everybody's like, it doesn't even matter that we're here. You're just reading an essay. Why don't you just hand this to us on the way in and we could just walk out and get in the front of the line at the buffet on Sunday? Remember this, it's crazy. They watch you more than they hear you. And more is communicated by your physical presence than your words. We'll get more into this later. But it is weird that more is communicated by your physical actions than your verbal actions. That doesn't mean the verbal actions don't matter. I can prove it. Ready? You're like, now he's just doing an interpretive dance. What the heck is going on? It is the interplay between the speech and the actions, but the way that you actually present yourself has a lot to say. Far more than we give credence to. And just like, yep, I want to listen to that person. It's on display in how you sound. It's one of the reasons why we work so hard on pushing you to sound like yourself instead of sounding like somebody else, because you could be excellent in speech, move really well, and you're trying to ape John Piper, and it's like, get off the stage. Not because he's bad, but because you're not him. And you don't speak like that normally. This isn't normal, right? This whole like you're seated, I'm standing. There's a difference. There's a turning up of the volume of this unique moment, but it's still you. It's just you amplified. But it's still you. And ironically, one of the hardest parts about doing this is being yourself. Being the best version of yourself for the sake of other people. So these are the kind of questions you should ask. What kind of person am I presenting myself to be? What kind of person am I presenting the author to be, the characters of the story to be? To those above things, concerned, compassionate, reasonable, informed, wise. Like, I can't tell you the number of times that like facts about Jesus are pulled from the text and it's just like, so that's true. And you're like, well, but is it compelling? And do you think Jesus is a person worth following? Or is it just true? What role am I taking in relation to the audience? A fellow traveler, informed expert? Like, are you a real person? Which sounds so dumb. But we assume all these things. Like, well, of course, because I'm human. You're like, well, then act like it. Do you have struggles? Or are you just fine? How am I using my own experience or that of others to make my point? Am I demonstrating unnecessary or inappropriate bias? Ooh, huge one. If I ever hear any of you talk about the gays, I will publicly roast you, right? Especially if what you say has nothing to do with like the lived experience of a homosexual. It's like, you clearly have never done anything except watch Fox News and YouTube late into the night. Am I representing others, whether I am for them or against them, properly? Imagine they have a bullhorn on the front, especially if it's somebody who's like opposed to your position. Now I'm going to talk non-Christians, like liberal Christians or whatever. Imagine they have a bullhorn in the front row, and they can turn around and scream at the audience at whatever point. That's a bunch of BS. I don't believe that. Are you presenting them fairly? Are you presenting them so fairly that they're like, well, I don't agree with you. You got a point, and you're at least right about me. Am I demonstrating humble orthodoxy? I believe the truth, but I'm not a jerk about it. Playful obedience, which we've talked about from the very beginning of this course. I'm obedient to this word, but man, am I engaging in it in a way that's like playful, like I'm enjoying what's in here. And epistemic humility. I don't know everything. I'm not going to pretend like I do. What I do know is what's in the text. I'm going to try to make sense of what's in here. I'm going to try to get you to feel appropriately what's in here. And hopefully my character and the character of the people in the text is on display. You already do this stuff. And secular religious, it's the kinds of things that you appreciate the most when other people are speaking. So, do the hard work of asking yourself these kinds of questions all the time. And answer them honestly. And whatever you figure out that you're not doing these kinds of things, fix it. Go back and edit it. Not just for like technical precision, but it's like, wait, have I just like, I've probably said this in here before. Have I just lowered my eyes 3 degrees? Most of us preach like right over the tops of people's heads if we're scanning good. Just looking at your hairlines, right? Receding and not. Just looking at your hairlines. Just look people in the eyes. Put it in their laps. Don't just look at the balcony or the back row. Look at the people right in the front row. If you look at the front row, everybody else feels like they're being looked at. So you ever felt like that? Everybody's like, I have felt like that. Isn't that confusing? It is confusing. Try to speak to real people. Lower your gaze and speak at people, not just toward them. Now we're going to come back in the next hour and talk about what happens when we're trying to cross the river and there's obstacles in the way. Because there's always obstacles in the way. This is confirmation. And the question is, what happens when we're in that process of confirmation and stuff is in the river that we got to get around. So for now, let's take a break. We'll come back 35 after and hit it again.